Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Carnegie and OSEPI event with DPART to launch the results of very interesting research that we have done on moving from climate perceptions to climate action. This is coming at a critical moment when the European Union has undertaken the very ambitious policy framework of the European Green Deal and is now seeking to translate the overall framework into concrete actions and measures, which will affect every corner of society and every part of the European economy, as well as Europe's relations with the rest of the world. So the stakes could not be higher for the European Green Deal. And yet, although Europe is showing a great deal of leadership on the Green Deal, it still doesn't really have enough followership. We'll be talking about how far the public is prepared to follow where Frans Timmermans, Ursula von der Leyen and the European Parliament have led. And looking across countries in a very interesting survey of 7 European countries plus the United States, plus also the differences that we see by age and also by party affiliation and a number of other data points in research to be presented by Jan Eichhorn in just a moment. This comes at a particularly timely moment for the European Union, on the brink of finally getting to a deal on much of the funding that will be essential to make the European Green Deal a reality, and also on the eve of the launch of the European Climate Pact, which is due in the second week of December, and which aims to engage citizens and encourage individual and community level action. We'll hear more about that later from one of the key architects of the Pact. It's also a moment when there have been a large number of climate assemblies and other forms of democratic participation in innovative forms which engage citizens in deliberation on climate. There have been a number of those across quite a few European countries, most notably France, also Ireland, and of course the UK. And these new methods of engaging citizens have shown the level of interest and also the degree of sophistication that citizens have in the ideas that they take on board, the innovative solutions they themselves propose, and the extent to which they can take back their findings and their new knowledge, as well as their own opinions, to their own communities. And that helps to engage in a different way from the way that representative democracy has tended to talk about climate. So we'll have a chance to discuss all of these matters today. The event is jointly hosted by the Open Society European Policy Institute, where I'm the director, and DPART, which is a research think tank based in Berlin, and Carnegie Europe. We're very pleased to join up with you today. You can send your questions to the panel at any time by writing in the YouTube chat of this event or by tweeting at Carnegie_Europe. So at Carnegie_Europe is the Twitter handle that you can use to put your questions, as well, of course, tweeting about the event. So I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers and first of all have a presentation of the report's results. So Jan Eichhorn is a political scientist who's the is the research director of DPART, the Berlin-based research group. He's also senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Edinburgh. He's one of the main designers of the methodology of this project, as well as the main author of the report, which is also available on it. Dr. Jan Eichhorn has a great deal of experience in conducting public opinion surveys and understanding what lies behind the raw numbers. And in this case, in particular, looking beyond the basic questions about climate awareness and climate measures, more deeply into how people think about it and what measures they're prepared to support. So over to you, Jan. We're looking forward to hear about the data.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining our conversation today. I'm just going to share my screen to be able to show you some slides. So just bear with me 1 second, and then I will present some of the key findings from our survey. So you should be able to see the slides now. I'm only going to present some of the, so to speak, headline findings. There's much more in-depth work, obviously, in the survey, but I'm going to focus on some of the key messages, some of the key insights that we gained in trying, as Heather described, understanding how people think more deeply about climate change and climate action, and what is behind some of the kind of top line findings we often hear about. The research that I'm presenting is based on a representative survey conducted in the 9 countries you see here on the screen. And it is representative for the population aged 18 to 47 in those 9 countries. So 7 member states of the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom and the US. And the data was collected in August 2020. So it's from this year, a very difficult year in many instances, but one in which debates about the climate crisis obviously continued. So I'll talk first about some of the key perceptions that we could see across those countries, and then look at how those perceptions translate or don't translate into climate action. First of all, as others have shown as well, we know that most people are aware of climate change. So what you see here is for each of the country, the respondents who say that the climate is changing in the darker blue colors, and that is the vast majority of people. There's only a very small minority that doubts basically the existence of climate change. It's largest at 11% in the United States here as a comparison point, but that really is a minority view. So overall, people are aware of the existence of climate change, but that doesn't mean that we can be satisfied with that situation, because we will quickly see that the depth into how much people understand what is happening is not as encompassing. So what you see here is a graph that shows you the response to a question where we asked people whether they think climate change is mostly caused by human activity, natural processes, or both. Now, again, in the darker blue colors, that's the percentage of people who say that climate change is mainly caused by humans. In other words, that is the amount of people in each country who see correctly climate change, who attribute climate change correctly, largely to human activity. And as we can see in quite a few countries, that is the majority of people. However, in all of the countries surveyed, there's a large minority, or in France, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the United States, even a majority of people who isn't aware of this important fact, who think that either climate change is equally man-made and human-made, nature-made, or even mostly caused by natural processes. So there is still a big gap in knowledge about the origins of climate change. Similarly, we do see that the scientific consensus, the so often cited number, 97% of climate scientists agree on the human causes of climate change, this scientific consensus is not yet shared by populations overall. What you see here is the percentage of people in each country who is not aware of this, who think that scientists are roughly equally divided on whether climate change is caused by humans or not. Now, in some countries, that is a minority, but still a sizable minority of over a third, in Spain, France, and Germany, for example. But if you look at the United States, Poland, and the Czech Republic, it's more than half of people who incorrectly think that basically science is split on the issue. And we also see more nuanced views on what people think climate change will mean for their own lives. When we ask people, what do they think would happen to them because of climate change in the next 15 years if we don't do anything, there's only a minority on the left-hand side here who think that it would have a severe negative impact on their lives. There's also a minority here on the far right in the lightest blue who think there won't be a negative impact or even a positive impact. But in all countries, a large group in the middle that acknowledges that climate change would have an impact on their lives, but thinks that it's not that big, that it's an impact that we can adapt to, but not something that will be necessarily disruptive. So there is quite a bit of a gap in terms of their understanding of the potential severity of climate change. Now, importantly, knowledge and these evaluations of the severity are strongly connected to each other. So what you see here is for each country, the respondents broken down into 3 groups. On the left-hand side, in the dark blue, are those people who correctly attribute climate change to to human action predominantly. In the middle, those who think it's equally human and nature caused. And the bar on the right-hand side, the lightest blue, those are the ones who incorrectly say that it's mostly caused by natural causes. And what you see here is that in all of the countries, those who know more, who correctly attribute climate change to human activity, they are much more likely to also expect a more severe impact. And in some countries, we can really talk about a degree of knowledge polarization here. It is strongest in the United States, where those who know that climate change is predominantly caused by human activity are 16 times as likely as those who think it's mostly naturally caused to expect a severe negative impact. But we see that in a lot of other countries here, that difference is also quite large. We also see something similar for the perceptions of impact. So people who basically expect more of that impact also see more negative experiences. Importantly, though, this is also differentiated in most of the countries by people's political position. So again, here you see the percentage of people who expect a strong negative impact of climate change on their own life. But this time we split the population in each of the countries according to people's self-classification in the classic left-right spectrum. So the dark blue bar are people who identify as left. The lightest bar are those who identify as right. And what you can see is, again, in a lot of the countries, those who identify as more left are more likely to say that they expect a strong negative impact from climate change. Now, in some countries, again, this polarization is bigger than in others. It's biggest in the United States, but for example, it's also very pronounced in Sweden and the United Kingdom here. Interestingly, however, on ideological polarization, it's not very pronounced in Central Eastern European countries. There's none of it here in the Czech Republic, for example, at least in this terms of self-classification. So there are differences between countries here as well. And all of this matters for the willingness of people to take action against climate change and their support for government actions. And that's why we're so interested in this. Now, overall, people want basically reactions against climate change. What you see here is just a simple question in which people were asked what we should do overall. And in the dark blue bar is the percentage of people who say we should do everything we can to stop climate change, followed by those who say we should do something, but we should mostly adapt our lives to climate change so we can live with that changed climate. And it's only a minority, again, in the light blue who say we don't need to do anything. We do see differences between countries here, quite a few countries where a majority of people say we should do everything to stop climate change, whereas countries like the Czech Republic and Sweden, for example, are more split in terms of whether we should focus on stopping climate change or adapting to it. But really importantly, this is linked back to the amount of knowledge that people have. So again, here in the dark blue bar, like before, you see those who correctly attribute climate change predominantly to human activity. And they are much more likely to say that we should do everything we can to stop climate change than those who think that climate change is mostly caused by natural origin. Again, this is also the same pattern for those who have greater impact perceptions. So those who think that basically there's going to be a stronger impact on their own lives and on life on Earth overall, so those are those in the dark blue bars, they are much more likely to say that we should do everything we can against climate change than those who expect a less negative impact from climate change, those in the lighter blue bars here. Now, if people want action, then who's responsible for that action? This was one of the next questions we've asked. And what you see here is 4 different actors we asked about. On the left-hand side in the dark blue bar is the question of how much people feel responsibly personally to act against climate change, followed by large international firms, national governments as the 3rd bar, and finally for member states, the European Union. What we see is, first of all, that there's a great degree of variation to what extent people feel personally responsible. It's much lower in Poland and the Czech Republic, for example, than it is in a lot of the other countries surveyed. But what we see is that in all of the countries we look at, people attribute much more responsibility to government acting than to themselves. And in most countries, people attribute more responsibility to governments also than to large international firms. And in the member states, people attribute as much or more responsibility than to their national governments to the European Union. So it's very clear people want national governments and the EU to act on this. That doesn't mean, however, that people don't do anything themselves. We've asked what sort of things people say, at least they have done already, that is in the dark blue bars here, or what people say they would at least consider to do in the future. And what you can see here is that a lot of people say that they have at least taken some actions already, like buying fewer plastic goods, sometimes traveled less by car, or that they are considering those things potentially in the future. But it is important to note that there, on some issues, that is a lot more aspiration than there is action. For example, in switching to a green energy firm for one's electricity supply. Even more importantly, though, is that we see while people do consider personal consumer actions, they are much less likely to consider actions that have a collective civil society orientation. So while there's a decent amount of people, just under half, who, for example, say they've already have tried to influence friends and family potentially, the numbers drop significantly when we ask for things like whether people make this a decisive thing in their voting decision or whether they support environmental organizations. But we know from a lot of research that it's really that individual action is really important, but that we also need to take this individual action and translate it into collective action. For a lot of people, that second step hasn't become ingrained basically yet in their thinking, that their own action also translates into something more collective. Importantly, though, once again, those people who have greater knowledge about the human causes of climate change and people who understand the severity of the issue better, they are more likely to take more individual consumer action, and they are also more likely to take greater collective-oriented actions. So those fundamental points really matter. Two final points that I want to make. The first one is, what do people think actually matters in their own actions? It might give us a bit of an idea why people seem to be focused much more on personal consumer actions. We've asked them, what is the best thing an individual can do to basically have a positive impact on the climate? And in all countries, to a varying degree, the number one choice was people saying they should reduce their own waste and recycle more. Now, while those things are positive and obviously can help in terms of habit formation into climate-friendly activities, they are not necessarily in their own right the things with the biggest impact on people's personal carbon footprint. We do see in some countries that people, for example, are quite aware of the issues around things like taking fewer flights. But in all of the countries, especially collective actions like supporting organizations that fight climate change are much less pronounced. So people clearly think in terms of what they have efficacy on in terms of their action, much more about things that are literally very close to home. So there's space to develop here. We've also asked questions about what government should do. Now, this is just an overview questions. We've asked loads of questions in our survey on policy-specific areas, like what to do about carbon emissions from meat production, flights, and cars. But this is just one example for where we asked what's the best thing a government could do in terms of reacting to it, with a range of loads of different things that are being discussed. Now, most importantly, very few people say government should do nothing across all of these countries. So people want action in practice. And we see that also for policy-specific questions. However, the sort of things people are often drawn to in a lot of the examples we talk about are either things that basically provide infrastructure that make things cheaper for them rather than more expensive, or things that help them organize in certain ways. Here, for example, making public transport free of charge is very popular, or allowing communities to generate their own energy. More popular than things like taxation regimes, which are probably also more abstract, more difficult to understand. Now, I promised to only speak 15 minutes and they are over, so I'll conclude at this point. Very briefly, the main findings, and there's much more depth and nuance obviously in the report. One, there is a soft consensus that climate change is happening, but that is not enough. We need to get more people to understand about the precise role of human activity and the severity of the crisis. If we shift people's knowledge in this direction, that has a positive impact on people's willingness to take action themselves and to support government action. But we do see that there are big differences between countries in terms of what sort of, for example, political or ideological dimensions this debate is polarized over or attached to. So country-specific approaches are needed. Most people are willing to take some action, but it's more consumer and person-oriented. So there's space to develop that in more collective orientations as well. And people want governments and the European Union to act. However, they are mostly focused on things that don't result in big trade-offs for themselves. So if those things are to be developed, we might want to think about more of how to bring people along that way. But I'll stop here and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and then joining the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that succinct overview of a huge amount of data. And just to remind everybody, this report is available from the Open Society European Policy Institute. And you can look at all of the findings there. And it's also on the website of DPART, so D-P-A-R-T. And we're now going to have an opportunity to talk about the implications of this data immediately with somebody who is working on the public communication of the European Green Deal and how to ensure the continued public support for the measures that the Commission is rolling out, which the EU is committed to in order to reach its carbon neutrality target by 2050. So we have with us Jori Keijsper, who is the communications advisor to Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, who's of course the Commissioner responsible for the European Green Deal and for climate policy. She oversees Executive Vice President Timmermans' media engagements and other communications activities. And so she's there working on how to reach the public on all of these matters, no small feat. And of course, we have coming up some quite major rollout of ways of trying to engage the public more deeply. Now, you have in the report, Jori, quite a few interesting points about the variation across countries. So I'm interested to know how you're trying to tailor the Commission's approach, because there has to be a pan-European approach, but it also needs to take account of national sensitivities, and particularly as this shows the quite widely varying degrees of awareness and knowledge about the impact, the likely impact and the predicted impact of climate change on people's daily lives and on the kind of disruption they might expect to see in their societies. And there's also a big differentiation across the countries in terms of what people are prepared to do as individuals and also collectively in terms of how they see things now. And I was struck by in Jan's last couple of charts, the lack of correlation between the most popular measures like recycling and reducing waste and the ones that would have most impact on biodiversity preservation and on cutting carbon emissions. So what are the conclusions that you draw for your work in communicating the Green Deal?
Yes, thank you very much, Heather, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also, Jan, for your presentation and the team at Carnegie and OSIPI for organizing this event. And let me also, first of all, say that I'm, of course, by far not the only one working on the Green Deal related communications in the Commission. Fortunately, there is a very big team that's also working with the Executive Vice President. So when I look at these data, I of course look at them from the Green Deal perspective, and I think what you said, Heather, about that the differences it notes between certain member states, the member states that were part of the research, I think we have our work laid out for us moving forward. What I'd like to say about the Green Deal is that if you look at its origins, it grew sort of from the streets, from the public, from the grassroots, and that's fairly unique also for Commission policy. You know, we saw sustained demonstrations in 2018, 2019. Mr. Timmermans, he campaigned on it in 2019, but even perhaps more importantly than all these mobilizations, we've seen that at home, the conversation has shifted. Children started asking their parents difficult questions at the kitchen table. And when I look at my own friends as well, it became much more normal to talk about being vegetarian because of climate change, or traveling by rail instead of plane, organizing clothing swaps. And then, you know, I'm only a millennial. I'm not even Generation Z. So there's already a big grassroots change that's happening, that's self-sustaining. And so this all helped the Green Deal take center stage when the Commission first took office. And then we had of course we're in this bizarre year with the pandemic, and still you see, and you do also see that in the research from Depart, that the essential concerns people have about climate change and about the need for acting on climate change is still there. And that also explains the Green Deal's resilience, so to say, over the past year. Because I think it's a recognition we have no choice, and you see that very clearly in Jan's research, that there's an awareness we will have to change. The degree to which we will have to change, the speed, that's still open for discussion, and you see differences there. But it's talking about an adaptation, and I think that also has to do with what people experience day to day. Climate change at this point has reached a stage where we're seeing the effects, where last summer in Brussels, we had 44 degrees Celsius. People know that is not normal. And weather extremes are, of course, only one aspect of climate change, but they are very visible, and they make it impossible for people to turn away. But I think also picking up on something in the research, adaptation for me is a key variable. We know it's going to have the Green Deal, the green transition, our path to climate neutrality is going to have a profound transformation, but we want to take it in a managed way. So in that sense, adaptation for me is a key word. The focus is on managing it. We don't want to make it a big shock, because that's actually what's going to happen if we don't act, if we don't do anything. So going a little bit back to about communicating about the Green Deal, for me, there are these two very interesting forces. On the one hand, you have this big grassroots movement that I mentioned earlier. There's also, I should mention, there's also a big shift in the business community among investors that in itself is driving change in small and large ways. And on the other hand, indeed, we have this agenda that implies a huge transformation that's going to impact everything. And that's also very much focused from our perspective on leaving no one behind, on including everyone. So over here, you have this self-generating action, often very positive. Sometimes it goes into extreme and might drive people away, but generally it's a positive, you know, we're going to improve the world. And on the other hand, you have this apparent need for a much more top-down communication, you know, to get the support for the policies that you want. And what we do, you know, in some contexts, it will be a very stern message, kind of wake up, smell the coffee moment. This is the reality. And on the other hand, it's much more focused on that we're going through this together, because that is the truth. We're all going through this transition. And presenting something to the European public as a sort of medicine, you know, you have to take this, swallow it, that's not going to work. And so in addition to these two forces, there's also a challenge of breaking this huge transition down into bite-sized pieces. And linking back to the question you asked me about the degree of the actions that people are willing to take, how they're different. What I wonder is, does that have to do with also the things you can easily control? It's easy for me to recycle my plastic bottles, but buying an electric car in itself is already much more complicated. Do I have the funds for it? Is there a place to charge it? You know, so there's this aspect as well to take into account. And the same goes in terms of communication. You can look at climate change and just think, oh my God, this is so big. I just want to curl up and hide, but we can't. So you have to break it down. And I sometimes like to see our goal of climate neutrality as sort of a future house. You know, we're building this house together, and we have agreed that it should be a house where we can all live, and we even have a draft of the design. That's great, but now we actually have to start building that house, and we'll build it stone by stone. It's not a prefab house, you know, it's not 4 walls, a roof, done. It's not that easy. It's a difficult transition. And the stones also, it requires craftsmanship. It's every step, every single action is important. And so even the smallest actions, even if it is recycling your plastic bottles, It's in itself not enough, but it could be, and I think Jan mentioned this when we spoke earlier, it's a gateway to action. So the other thing to note about the climate change, and I can link this to the Climate Pact, which we will indeed present in 2 weeks' time, the key role played by knowledge. I think that's for me the biggest takeaway from all of the research. You see how the knowledge about scientific consensus, knowledge about the degree human activity drives climate change. That's a key takeaway, because also it influences the willingness to take action. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to launch the European Climate Pact. This is part of the Green Deal. I can't say much about it because we're still 2 weeks out, but how I always put it is that this pact is the Commission's contribution to climate action across Europe. Anyone can take action, everyone can take action, and there's a lot that's already happening, great, happening on its own, but we want to do what we can to amplify, inspire, help connect. And if we just inspire one extra person to take action, you know, that's already something. And taking this action starts with knowing why you are taking action. So knowledge and sharing knowledge is going to be a big part of the pact. One aspect of the pact is that we will work with so-called ambassadors, people who are willing to go out into their own communities to engage with them about and discuss about climate change. We've already started recruiting the first ones, and there's quite some interest. But these are ways that at a grassroots level, we can help ensure that the basics are known to everyone. And the other thing, going back to what I said about the small steps and the enormous task we have ahead, we have to also marry the small steps to the big picture, because we know they're not enough. Right, recycling your trash is not going to save the planet, but we also need to find a way to keep track of everything what we're doing so we can know how far we've come. And so you also see that a focus on small action, on empowering people who want to do something, to show them the way, and to keep track of everything that we're doing. Because I think that it's very motivating to be able to look back and to see how far you've come. And then the way ahead might still be long, it might still be steep, it might still be difficult, but you've already set so many steps, so you can have confidence that we continue.
Thank you very much, Jori, for these reflections on what the data tells the Commission, and how it helps to inform the political communications work, which is clearly essential, because the consensus is there. This data shows that there's an overwhelming consensus for action. People know climate change is happening. There's very little outright climate denial, but there's still a lot of work to do on making that consensus firmer and more solid so that it can be sustained over the decades to come. So somebody who's looked very closely into how it can be sustained and how citizens engage with it is our third speaker today, Claire Mellier. She was part of the facilitation team at the Climate Assembly UK and one of the accredited researchers who observed France's Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat. She's currently working with the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation at Cardiff University on a comparative analysis of the two climate citizens' assemblies. And she's also developing a global assembly in the run-up to COP26, which is due to happen next year, having been postponed by the corona crisis. And that global assembly will be launched in December. And she's written a recent article for Carnegie Europe on getting climate citizens' assemblies right. So Claire, what does this data tell you? How does it match up with your own observations in France and the UK of how citizens are engaging with it? Were there surprises here, or was it mostly familiar stuff? Were there things that really stuck out as issues that need to be addressed by policymakers in how they communicate?
Well, thank you, Heather, and good evening, everybody. Well, Jan's research is fascinating because it's providing a snapshot of what a representative sample of different populations across Europe think without having been exposed to scientific evidence or having gone through any learning process. So what you could say is what you're presenting there, potentially we could assume this is what a representative sample of that has been selected for a citizens' assembly would think initially, because that's how these citizens' assemblies are formed. So just briefly to give you a view of what a citizens' assembly is a representative sample of a population that has been selected based on various criteria. So you've got a sample of a population that is based on gender, diversity of income, education, etc. And then you take this group through a learning phase. So you take them on a learning journey where you get scientific input, experts, knowledge input, but also community input, lived experience. And in terms of climate change, we've seen over the last year really interesting examples, as you've said, Heather, the Climate Assembly UK, the French Convention. Currently, there is a citizens' assembly happening in Denmark and in Scotland as well. And there are a few more planned in Spain, Germany, and further afield. So what's interesting is that what we've seen with both the UK and the French Assembly, UK and French Assembly, is that when you take people on this learning journey, you get a realization of the scale of the challenge, the urgency, and as a result, they come up with recommendations which are far more ambitious than any government has ever come up with, both in the UK and France. So this shows that actually what Jan was saying in his research, that people who are aware, for instance, of the human reasons for climate change or human causes are more likely to support measures to fight climate change. So this is what we've seen throughout, the UK and the French assemblies, is that people are more likely to support ambitious and more radical policies to fight climate change because they've gone on this learning journey. So that's really, for me, that's one of the really interesting findings, is that the benefit of deliberation is this. At the moment, what we're seeing is, in a way, the limits of these citizens' assemblies is they are engaging deeply a small number of people. So it's giving a public mandate for politicians to be more ambitious. But what it's not doing as much as it could potentially is create a wider conversation and bring along all the people you're describing in your survey, that we need to get on board, to commit to more action and support more ambitious action. So that's something that is really interesting, I think, for the future, in terms of how citizens' assemblies are designed in the future, is trying to design processes which are actually both bringing the depth of deliberation, but also the width of participation. And there are ways at the moment, I think, some people are thinking about that, and with the Global Assembly, we're currently working on that, a model we're really thinking through really carefully, because I think that's important. What I would say that I found really interesting, and that's a point Jori mentioned, which is around adaptation. I think that's something that is really interesting, because it's also been missing actually from these citizens' assemblies. They've been looking purely at climate mitigation, and it became really quite obvious that if you are not really engaging with what impact climate change is going to have on your lives, really, like practically at your village level, or you're missing potentially an opportunity for more radical support for action. And so we could say that these assemblies have been really good, and they've proven that they can promote ambitious climate policies, but still I think we're missing something by not looking at adaptation. And I know that's a recommendation that Chris Stark and the Committee on Climate Change has recommended. He's recommended actually a citizens' assembly on adaptation, and that will be, I think, another aspect in future processes, is how do we bring adaptation into the conversations? Because when people start realizing that it's impacting them directly, then they become more supportive. And that's another finding that I found really interesting in your research, Jan, which is Spain and Italy seem to have consistently higher support for ambitious action, and I know there's a climate assembly planned in Spain soon, and I know adaptation will be a key part probably of their assembly, but maybe that's something we can talk about a bit more in the discussion. But I'm really interested in that, whether you've got a bit more granular information on this. So yeah, as Jori said, I think adaptation is crucial, and what we mean by adaptation, that's something I'm interested in as well, because people seem to define adaptation in many different ways. And we've seen, for instance, in France and the UK in the last few months, emerging these conversations around collapsology and deep adaptation in the UK. And so that's, for me, there's a spectrum of perspective on adaptation, going from the extreme, collapsology in France and societal collapse, all the way to adaptation in a very practical way, like repainting your roof in white to reflect, sunshine, because that's what we're heading towards, or building flood defenses. And this is also coming up in, for instance, I was involved recently in a climate citizens jury in Kendal, very small, the first town level climate citizens jury. And there are major problems around flooding in Kendal, and conversations around flood defense in Kendal and adaptation coming up. So we see that there's a need to look at both adaptation and mitigation in parallel, and not split this. And maybe I'm conscious of time, but I'll probably add one more point, which is about this finding, Jan, about individual action versus collective action. And again, I think that's where the citizens' assemblies are proving really powerful, because people realize that it's not just about recycling, and it's much more, it's wider than that. And that's why you end up with 149 measures on a wide range of themes in the French Convention, and over 50 recommendations in the UK Assembly. And the idea is that you can't actually cherry pick. You need to have these packages. It's not just about small individual action. But if we talk about collective action, I think we're potentially missing something, which is about system level action. So what does collective action means, but what actually do we mean by system level or system change? And again, I think that's what is missing from these citizens' assemblies at the moment, is that they are not actually allowing deep, meaningful deliberation on what we call leverage points, or what are the biggest opportunities for transformation in the most effective way. So what I mean is like biggest impacts in the shortest time frame, because we're talking about scale of climate change impact, but it's also about the urgency and how do you make the quickest impact. Yes. So that's maybe I'll leave it there, but that was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for those very interesting thoughts on the opportunities and the limits of climate assemblies for engaging the public, particularly your points about they have this wonderful depth and allowing the people who participate to have a great deal more knowledge, both about how they can themselves in their own lives reduce their climate impact, as well as spreading the knowledge among their communities about potential collective responses, and yet limits because there's only so many people who can be involved. And your last point about particularly about systems change. This is really an enormous systems change, and one of the key quite shocking findings in a way from the survey that Jan presented is how people don't see that system change coming. They see a few changes, a few adaptations at the margins of their lives, but they're not appreciating how much this is going to transform the economy and society. And that point doesn't seem to have got over yet, which is why things like the European Climate Pact with ambassadors at local level would be very important. So we've got a couple of questions that I'd like to put to you. The first one is, who are the largest emitters in Europe, and how will the Green Deal help to curb these emissions? And perhaps, Jori, you'd like to address this, particularly thinking about the survey results, which showed that people are willing to do things, but not necessarily the things that have the biggest impact on emissions. And that's also the case with governments, of course. The phrase of the age is low-hanging fruit, but the low-hanging fruit aren't necessarily the ones that cut the emissions the most. So what are ways of engaging the public in understanding rather better which measures they could undertake that would have the most effect on the climate?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think this is a good question about the action that we need on different levels. I think for our conversation, of course, is very much focused on much more the individual level, and at least the individual acknowledgement of needing to take action. But when you look at the Green Deal, it's of course a big package that's also very much focused on legislation, on new laws, on ways to basically require industry to cut down emissions. And the good news is it's already working. If you compare where the EU stands now compared to 1990, we have reduced our CO2 emissions by roughly 25%, and still the economy has grown. So we're showing it is possible to do both at the same time. I won't get too technical, but when it comes to ensuring by the Green Deal that emissions go down, we have two main instruments. The first is an emissions trading system, which is between power companies. That's a really effective way of bringing down emissions. Next year, we will come with a proposal to expand this system and to strengthen it. So to include more sectors, but also make it stricter, because we have concluded that we need to cut emissions faster to reach our goal of climate neutrality. And the other part is an effort sharing law amongst the member states. So anything that's not covered in this emissions trading, because that's across Europe, across sectors, any emissions that are not covered in this emissions trading is covered in the effort sharing, and that's tailored to the relative weight of every country, of every member state. Now, the second part of your question, Heather, about the individual action and about explaining that, I think that's in a sense the beauty of the Green Deal. It's the difficulty of the Green Deal because it's very big. It encompasses almost all sectors and every aspect of the economy, but it also has this layered of levels. It has this super high level governmental legislation about cutting emissions, and then you have something like the Climate Pact, where we're actually at a much more granular level, trying to reach out to people, and that's not something that the Commission is usually doing. We're much more a legislative machine, and so I think this Climate Pact for me is very, very exciting because it offers a way to engage, for example, through the ambassadors. On a much more direct level with citizens willing to take action. And the crucial task also for me and my colleagues is to bring these two together. Like, how are the day-to-day actions that you can take as an individual, how is that helping in the bigger scale of things? And I think what Claire mentioned about assemblies, about possibly more system change, that's also a way to start building that awareness among people. And I would also say that what Claire said about adaptation, I very much agree, because when I talk about adaptation, I mean not the more formalistic climate adaptation or the idea that adaptation means acceptance. It means that we adapt our lives to the realities of climate change, but also by doing so, we adapt it in a way that we actually help fight climate change. So it's the more gradual nature of that. So thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to go on to another question, which is about the political party affiliation and the correlation between whether people perceive themselves to be more on the right or the left of the political spectrum and their views on climate. Now, in the survey results, there were some quite striking differences between countries. In the United States, there's the highest degree of polarization, with a really big difference between people on left and right, both in their perceptions about whether climate change is happening, their knowledge about it, and their willingness to act. Whereas in Central Europe, in Poland and the Czech Republic, for example, that's almost non-existent. There isn't any difference between left and right. Now, climate is bound to become, in some ways, a political football, a bit like migration has become. It's an easy wedge issue for populists to exploit. But the question we have is a very interesting one about techno-solutionism. So the question is, do you think that people who identify with the right and don't perceive climate impacts on their own lives as likely to be negative, people who don't think that it's going to have a severe impact on their own lives in a negative way, do you think that they believe markets will deliver technology and, for example, carbon capture and storage solutions as the answer to climate change, so that other measures won't be necessary? Now, scientists, of course, strongly suggest that technological solutions will not be enough by any means. That can only capture and store a very small amount of emissions. But how widespread do you think the techno-solutionism is, and is it a matter of political party leaning? Jan?
So it's a really, really interesting question. The important thing first is obviously to say that we're looking at tendencies. The polarization doesn't necessarily mean that there are insurmountable barriers in between. So even in the United States, where we saw the biggest polarization on these issues, I've had a look at that this week, actually. When you look, for example, at Republican voters, well, 25% of them say basically we don't need to do anything. But that is only a quarter. That's a big amount within a big voter group, but it is only a quarter who rejects the idea of doing anything. So most of them want some action, but they then split into the ones who think more about adaptation and those who think about transformation. 40% of Republican voters in the United States say we should do everything we can to stop climate change. So when we talk about this, even when we talk about left and right, and more specifically political parties within countries, we are talking about a spectrum within each group. So that means basically, if we think about center-right parties rather than far-right parties, where we do see a lot of more rejectionism, we think of center-right parties in a lot of countries, a lot of people in that group want a lot of action. So we've looked at the German Christian Democrats, for example. 60% of their voters want to stop climate change, by and large, but there is a big minority that focuses more on the adaptation narrative. So what does that mean? We've looked at some of those questions around technology and so on. Yes, people believe a bit more in it. People believe in the voters of those parties believe a bit more into market solutions. That's unsurprising. But most of them don't think that's the whole story either. So it's really a matter of degree. When you look at voters of center-right parties, they think there's a mix of market solutions, state solution, taxation schemes that can be brought in. So it's not that we should think about voters of particular parties as only favoring one view, but kind of different combinations of a range of instruments that they would like to see. And in a sense, I think there's a real chance for center-right parties here. They can embrace, in nearly all of these countries, they can embrace climate change as an issue that their voters care about. But actually, their voters are kind of split. There are voters who focus more on transformation and some who focus more on adaptation, whereas voters of left-wing parties much more focus on transformation. Well, here's a chance for center-right parties, I would say. Well, the IPCC says we need transformation and adaptation, like Claire and Jori have said as well. So there is a chance for center-right parties, I think, to create a narrative around, bringing both things together in a really ambitious way. That can actually help think about things in a more systematic way, where we think about what is the interplay, for example, between markets and the states. Most of their voters want to talk about that interplay, not only about markets. So there is an opportunity there potentially.
Yeah, and a very important opportunity to take up, given that it will need to be a whole of society, whole of economy change, that it's very risky for it to become a left-right issue in Europe. Frans Timmermans said after the European Parliament elections last year, all parties are green now. Not just those who call themselves green, but everybody has to embrace the agenda. And of course, there are centre-right parties like, for example, the CDU in Germany, who have a long history of supporting nature conservation, conservatives for conservation. And so calling on those things those traditions is important. Just time for one final question, and whichever of you would like to take it up is welcome to do so. So Jori mentioned earlier that people are starting to experience extreme weather in their own lives. Farmers are certainly noticing it across Europe, but also everybody. Those of us living in Brussels, for example, experienced 44 degrees last summer. All of us experienced it, the 44 degrees. So the question is, does anybody here have any cases where they've seen corporate managers engaging more with climate mitigation actions after experiencing more frequent or stronger extreme weather events? There's nothing in this survey, I don't think, but I just wonder if you have some reflections, Claire, for example, from the climate assemblies. Do citizens discuss extreme weather? Is this something that they have or maybe some of you, the others of you, have views on whether people actually experiencing these things in their own lives makes a difference to when they return to work, the way that they try and push their organization or try to take some kind of action with their family and friends.
There wasn't much emphasis on the impact of extreme weather events in France or in the UK, particularly. But just to reflect back on your previous question, which I think was really actually really interesting for Climate Assembly UK, is that one of the recommendations was to that the Assembly members were not really supportive of carbon capture and storage, and that they were supportive of natural methods such as tree planting and like restoring and managing peatlands and wetlands. So I think that was quite interesting to see that an assembly that had been informed came up with this as an outcome of refusing the techno fix. But for extreme weather, I don't think that's something that was actually really covered, and maybe partly because adaptation was not actually a major part of the discussions. I'm afraid I don't have much time.
Okay, thanks. Jori, would you like to comment on that quickly?
Yeah, I can add very quickly just an example. Of course, as part of the Green Deal, we have lots of meetings with stakeholders and also the business community. And what we hear, for example, from the south of France is that already there, the changing weather patterns make that certain crops that have grown for hundreds of years in south of France can no longer effectively be farmed there. And this is making big food producing companies like Danone realize that it's also in their interest to change things. And I think that's, as I said in my first comments, the drive to take action on climate change is not just coming from the activists, it's also a very strong voice from the business community, because they see their long-term business models effectively being in danger. And that realization, there is still some pushback, not everyone is on board, and that's of course, it's part of a process. But the group is growing. That's demanding action, and they of course also have the means to take these actions themselves. The long-term investments that are done by the business community help make this change. So just one example that we know, certain crops are no longer able to be farmed in Europe as a direct result of weather extremes and therefore climate change.
Yes. And of course, the big question is whether people will feel those effects in their own lives fast enough before we reach the critical tipping points that take us beyond the point of no return. So thank you all very much for this very interesting debate about what Europe should do to advance climate action. Just in conclusion, just to point out a couple of points that you've all made. One is that motivating people to move from being concerned about climate change to actually doing something about it is a process that really needs to engage everybody. It's got to happen at all levels, at national and EU level, but also at local level. And it's both the private sector as well as the state that needs to motivate it. You've also all stressed the need to engage citizens in new ways and across the political spectrum. This shouldn't, and it would be very dangerous for it to become a left-right polarized issue. And finally, you've all made the very good point that the more that people know, the more they're willing to take action. So simply spreading knowledge about climate science is really critical to maintaining public support and ensuring that climate denialism doesn't grow in Europe. What's now a widespread consensus is still quite soft, and there's a real danger that a strident minority that starts to spread misinformation about it could have a massive impact. Thank you all very much for a really interesting and nuanced conversation from your different perspectives and the practical experience that you've all had, both in research and also in policy making. We look forward to future events on climate with Carnegie Europe and with DPART as well. I encourage everybody to read the report. It's on the DPART website. It's also at Open Society European Policy Institute, and the very many interesting articles about climate